What's going on, guys? This is Miasin, and today I will be going over as many Super Poly targets as possible so we can try to figure out whether this card really is worth playing or not, and which kind of decks lose to the card. So before this video starts, make sure you like and subscribe. Check me out on Twitch and Instagram, and now let's jump right into it. Alright, so first of all, the top decks in this current format are Based, Phantom Knight, Drytron, Dragon Link, Prank Kids, etc. The list goes on, so many decks. So the majority of the Super Poly targets that I will be going over today are going to be targets that really beat those decks, but also some other decks as well. The most obvious Super Poly targets are the ones that are not really archetype or type locked, but rather attribute locked, such as Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, Predaplant Dragos Tapelia, and Predaplant Trifu Verdum. Technically, the most generic Super Poly target in the entire game is Mud Dragon of the Swamp, because you can actually say that this card covers the most ground out of every Super Poly target out there, and independently of the format, it's always going to be good against at least like 3 or 4 top tier decks. Just against Drytron, for example, if your opponent has Herald of Perfection with, let's say, the Drytron Ritual Monster 4000 attack, you can Super Poly both away since they're both light attribute monsters, but with different types, and that is actually how you make Mud Dragon of the Swamp. And definitely don't sleep on its effect, because it actually allows you to play around Effect Veiler, Imperm, and other cards. Now, to address the elephant in the room, which is the Based deck, you can actually break 4 negates just with one single Super Poly and protect yourself from the Artifact Scythe lock just by going Super Poly in draw phase to make Guilty Gearfried the Magical Steel Knight. It's a fusion monster that requires 2 warrior monsters with different attribute, and since your opponent summons Baroness de Fleur, which is a warrior wind, and Destiny will destroy Phoenix Enforcer, which is a warrior dark, you can Super Poly both away, and since the Phoenix Enforcer, your opponent will never have the ability to scythe you, and therefore you can full combo right after. Again, though, we have to assume the worst case scenario, and that would be the fact that your opponent also has other forms of negations. Let's just say your opponent has Herald of Arclight and either Griffin Rider or, let's say, Chi Jiao. In this example, let's just say Chi Jiao, your opponent actually has that card in order to negate your Guilty Gearfried while you try to attack over the Herald of Arclight, because your Guilty Gearfried can actually attack twice if it was the fusion summoned using only monsters on the field, which is the case thanks to Super Poly. So if your opponent does that, you can use the first effect of Guilty Gearfried, Chain, to negate and destroy a card on the field without targeting. Your opponent will, of course, use the effect of Herald of Arclight, and yeah, sure, you lose your Guilty Gearfried, and the 2 monsters on your opponent's field are still there, and you probably had to lose your battle phase since your opponent probably used this on the attack declaration. It's not really the end of the world, because at least you were able to break 2 negates, send them to the graveyard, prevent the scythe from happening, and also your opponent's 2 other negates were also baited out completely. Now, on the other hand, let's just say your opponent doesn't actually use Chi Jiao to negate your Guilty Gearfried preemptively, which is actually the correct play, by the way. Your opponent should preemptively negate. You attack over the Herald of Arclight, and then you attack over the Chi Jiao, and on damage step, use the final effect of Guilty Gearfried by banishing a spell card from your graveyard, which you're always going to have in the form of Super Poly, and your monster will gain attack, and therefore will be strong enough to jump over the Chi Jiao. And also, your opponent will not really have a grind game, because the Destiny will destroy Phoenix Enforcer was not destroyed. It was sent to the graveyard as a fusion material for the Super Poly in order to make the Guilty Gearfried, so your opponent will not have any recursion outside of the Celestial draw, I guess. So your opponent is basically on top deck mode while you still have 4 cards in hand, and you still have your normal summon and the ability to pop off and make your own negates. Anyways, against Prank Kids, this card is of course still very good, because you can fuse away the Battle Butler to make the Weather Washer, and that card is like an Armades-esque card, so when you attack, your opponent can't really respond. It's not the best, but it's better than nothing, I guess. It's better than playing Rocket Ride with like no Prank Kids targets in their grave. So against DDD, there are actually 10 billion fusion monsters that you can make with Super Poly, but the best one would probably have to be the DDD Flame Hiking Genghis. That one is absolutely busted, so you need 1 DD monster, and I believe 1 level 5 or higher DD monster, I forgot, and it's a Spell or Trap negate on your own turn only. So if you get to use this card on draw phase, fuse away the big DD monster and your opponent's Siegfried or something, you would not only get to break like 2 or 3 negates your opponent has, but on top of that, your opponent was not able to flip the Eternal Darkness yet, and therefore when your opponent does flip it, you can negate your opponent's Eternal Darkness with your own Hiking Genghis, which you summoned off of your opponent's DDD monsters. Invoked also loses very hard to Super Poly, but this time it actually depends on the board that they have. For example, if they control a Shaddoll monster, you can either Super Poly them for Shaddoll Construct or Winda. It really depends on the other kind of attributes they have, or that you might actually have in order to have kind of like a 50-50 on each side. Even more crazy is the fact that if they control an invoked monster like invoked Merkaba, which is probably always going to be the case, you can fuse away the Merkaba and potentially their Winda or something in order to make invoked Elijah, which is absolute game over for invoked, because not only you're able to make your opponent lose multiple negates, 2 gigantic negates in one shot, but also on top of that you have your non-targeting, non-destructive removal that banishes every single card, every single monster your opponent controls during either player's turn, and trust me, if you summon this card, you most likely win. Now for Cyber's decks such as Salamangrate, Adding Nistra, and Kotalker, Deplexer Chimera is very good, but World Chalice Dragon Almador could also be relatively good because that one requires 3 link monsters, so if your opponent is still playing, I don't know, like the good old extra link decks, well, at least you'll be able to get rid of them, but if they Ibly lock you, then I guess Super Poly wouldn't have been like the correct solution. And not that it matters, but if Beast Warriors become good again, well, maybe Brotherhood of the Fire Fist Swan could actually be pretty broken, because all it really needs is 2 Beast Warriors to be summoned. And I know Plunder Patrol isn't necessarily super popular, but Plunder Patrol Ship Lease is actually very broken against the deck because all you really need is 2 Plunder Patrol monsters and that's it, that's all. There are technically way more Super Poly targets, but I'm not necessarily going to try to go over every single one of them because that would take like 10 years, and there are some other cards that are actually also relatively decent depending on the format, such as Cordius the Triphasic Dealman. That's a mouthful. It requires 1 Synchro, 1 Xyz, and 1 Link. So against Adamancipator, for example, it would have been good if we had it back then. If your opponent ends on, I don't know, Appaloosa, Dweller, and Borload Savage Dragon, 1 single Super Poly can get rid of everything, and of course, Super Poly is really good against cards like Abyss Dweller because you can use Super Poly on draw phase since you have the turn player priority and your opponent cannot shotgun before you, and your opponent cannot chain the Dweller to the Super Poly. Therefore, it is one way of breaking these kind of negates. Anyways, that's pretty much all I had to say for this, I guess, card review or targets review for Super Poly. I try to make this video every single format, so we always have a good idea how you can really counter the meta with specific cards that, you know, have been good in the past. So if you have any thoughts, let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as always, and I'll see you guys very soon. Peace.